Hello. I am here today with Matt Barnum, the ideas editor at Chalkbeat. Matt and I have gotten to know each other a little bit over the past year, um, really over our shared passion, which perhaps unexpectedly came in the form of railing against the mainstream media's attention on the profession of welding. Not because we think welding is a bad job, and we'll get into that. We think welding careers are great, but because we think it gets overemphasized. And the past I think 3 weeks have been a great example of the nuance that could be available to the discourse if people so choose. And Matt wrote a great article for Chalkbeat about sort of the middle class of trades professions and what that looks like in reality. And the New York Times followed up with an article that is more of the what we'd like to dispel, the myths we'd like to dispel, which is sort of planting the trades and welding in particular. The headline of this article is about welding on a pedestal. And so I think what we'd like to get into today is the nuance behind what a trades career is and who it's right for, and sort of what folks should understand when they get into it that maybe wasn't covered in the New York Times article. So before we get into that, Matt, I'd love if you could just spend a little bit of time talking about who you are and how you got here, and maybe when you discovered your passion for dispelling myths about welding.
Well, I actually think I discovered my passion, such as it is. Paul Tough has a great book called The Inequality Machine, I believe, about higher education. And he has a chapter about how politicians have used careers and the trades careers and welding in particular as a sort of an argument against American higher education. And he really walks through the data. And this has really cropped up, a great number of news articles have cropped up, not just in particular about welding, but about various blue collar professions and vocations, sort of touting that as a better alternative to higher education. And as you alluded to, Matt, maybe it is for some people, it definitely is, but the sort of blanket suggestion that it is can be misleading. But I've been an education journalist for almost a decade now. I was at Chalkbeat as Chalkbeat's first national reporter several years ago, starting in 2017. And then I was at the Wall Street Journal for a few years, and I just came back to Chalkbeat almost a year ago to start this ideas section, which focuses on big ideas, big questions, big debates in education. And in that, I've sort of been dipping my toe into this sort of conversation that I've been thinking of as like pathways into higher education or out of higher education. And so that brought me to this particular article that we're going to talk about, what we know on, salaries and other things about non-college occupations, including blue collar trades.
And could you just maybe just get into the broad strokes of the article, if you could, to help
Yeah.
us ground us as we talk about the rest of the debate?
So there have been a number of articles that have, I would say the conventional wisdom, maybe a decade plus ago was that, well, of course, if you're a high school graduate, you should go to college because people who have college degrees make more money. There have been a number of news articles that have questioned that and essentially argue that, well, that sort of conventional narrative is maybe wrong. And maybe actually you can make six figures or even higher, or at the very least, a very good salary if you don't go to college, especially if you pursue blue collar careers like welding or becoming an electrician or other jobs like that. What I wanted to do was simply look at BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics data for occupations that do versus don't require a college degree. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. Really, BLS just categorized it based on the share of people 0 to 100 who have a college degree in each vocation. And so I categorize that as low degree attainment, medium, and high degree attainment. And the first thing that stands out is that the vast majority of occupations where most people don't have college degrees make below the national median and the national average. And that's not terribly surprising, but it is really important. And that was especially true in these very large non-college occupations like home health aides, where there are 4.3 million people, fast food workers, janitors, retail salespeople. those are the biggest non-college occupations, and they're not paid terribly well. Now, to give credit to the sort of blue collar trades narrative, the jobs that are above the national median and don't typically require college degrees, a lot of them are those blue collar trades. They're carpenters, they're supervisors of the blue collar trades, they're truck drivers, they're electricians. I think welding is just above, at $56,000 is the median national wage. So those are, if you are interested, if you don't want to go to college and you do want to make a living wage, like that really probably is your best bet. But I think the caveats are those are still making maybe just a bit above the median and maybe about the average or maybe even a little bit below. And there also just aren't that many of those jobs. I went through this in my article. It's like there are more home health aides than a bunch of blue collar trades all put together. So those are sort of the caveats when people are talking about the trades as this non-college salvation.
Yeah, I think there's two sort of really important stories here. And the first is, should you go to college?
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing that story play out on sort of both ends of the spectrum right now, which is um, people questioning the value of college, right? And saying like, even at elite schools, like, is this actually worth the hundreds of thousands of dollars that I am investing as, often an 18-year-old, increasingly anywhere from 18 to 40, that the time and money that it takes to go to college. And then there's another of like, are the trades a good career for me? And that could be inclusive of people who go to college. There's
Yeah.
sort of a trend on the high end of the spectrum of like elite MBA students buying into trades businesses. They're buying HVAC companies
Mm.
and trying to turn them into businesses that are interesting for private equity to buy. So
Yeah.
there's all this sort of interest in the trades. There's all this sort of interest in like, is college worth it? And I feel like where they meet in the middle and where this all gets conflated is the trades as this pathway to a six-figure career. And really, when we say six figures, it's sort of like a euphemism for, high earning, right? And
Mhm.
so what I think gets lost here is like, welding is like a pretty good job. To your point, the median welder is earning. I think you're right. It is almost exactly the median wage of the U.S. A
Yeah.
90th percentile welder. I had this up before. Let me see if I can find it. Is
It's
is
below
earning
100K, right?
it's below 100K, but it is something like 90K, right? It is like $90,000 is a pretty good. Oh, sorry. So a welder, the top 10% welder is earning 76,000. A
Mm.
top 10% HVAC tech is earning 90,000. The top 10% electrician is earning 106,000.
Right.
Plumber 105,000. So like it's not that trade careers do pay poorly. They pay reasonably well. $90,000 in most of the US is a really great income. But it's sort of this like conflation of like, I don't want to. I'm choosing not to go to college because it's bad value, and I will earn money, in the trade. I will earn more money in the trades. And it's like, well, we're sort of smushing a bunch of different topics together. So what I appreciate in our conversations is that we've tried to sort of unravel it and say, like, where is welding a good job? Like, where are there specific geographies where this could be interesting? Is the option, if you're not going to college, actually welding, or is it being a home health aide? And I thought your article did a great job laying that out and like saying, to your point about pathways, is home health way or is working as a home health aide actually leading to a higher earning job in healthcare after that? So I don't know if you have thoughts related to either the home health aide pathway or places where it is actually a good idea to be, a welder or a tradesperson.
Well, I think what has happened is there has been this intense backlash to elite higher education, which has driven a interest in promoting alternatives to college as better pathways for people. And I think these conversations are kind of have nothing to do with each other, but they have been smushed together, as you put it. I think, declining American confidence in higher education is driven by these elite schools that still have like massive demand. Like there are still way more students who want to go to Harvard or Princeton or Yale or even like lower tiers, but still selective elite universities than there are spots for them. And there's really no decline, as far as I can tell, in interest in those schools. There's also, actually, if you look at the numbers, despite people saying they have less confidence in American higher education, there's actually rising numbers of people going to 4-year colleges. And the real decline has been in 2-year community colleges until recently, and some for-profit colleges until recently. And so there's this like very weird disconnect that is in sort of backlash to higher education that is perhaps understandable, but then is sort of manifesting itself in this greater fascination with non-college routes. In terms of the particular, and I think much more like prosaic question of like, should a person go to college or should they pursue welding? The answer is like, do you want to have a career in welding, or do you want to have a career in a job that requires college? Do you like going to school? Does 4 years of college sound fun or exciting or miserable to you? What sort of college would you go to? Are you going to go to a college where you're going to rack up a lot of debt or not? Are you going to go to a more affordable public in-state college? So like those are sort of the relevant questions. And I think sort of putting it in the context of the sort of broader disillusionment with higher education is actually not very helpful.
Yeah, and I want to ask, and I'll give a little bit of context after. I want to ask about like why these stories are so interesting for as articles for consumption by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and those big national media outlets. And in so doing, I also want to give credit that the Times this year, and I think the Journal did one last year about auto technicians and like the actual mechanics of being an auto technician, which is like all piecework based. And so it's sort of acknowledging, and the Times this year acknowledged that like the entry level welder is making 25 an hour, which is again not terrible, but is not the path to $100,000. Again, 100,000 being a euphemism. So I feel like we're getting a little bit more into the details of like, being a piecework auto technician. It works for some people, but is a hard job. Entry level welding, again, works for some people, but is a hard job. So we're getting more nuance. But why does this like headline about like, mom, I want to be a welder, like so appetizing to national outlets?
Yeah, I don't want to speak totally for my colleagues in other outlets, and you never know how a story comes together. But I
Sure.
think broadly, we in the news business love counterintuitive findings and headlines,
Okay.
and we love a sort of a fresh take. And probably, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but probably most New York Times readers have college degrees. And for them, the idea of their kid or their future kid or their grandkids becoming a welder, you know, maybe it's not appealing to them. Maybe they don't think that's a good option. So a news article that is sort of like, well, actually, have you considered maybe that there are benefits to that career? That's kind of interesting and appealing. And, maybe to give some credit to the article, it's like, well, maybe some college educated parents have written off that career pathway because they underestimate what it makes. And so maybe that's reasonable. But I think on the other hand, like lots of parents and families like never like would have batted an eye and would be thrilled for their child to be a welder. So like that headline may apply to some parents, but lots of parents would be happy for their kid to be a welder and would sort of wonder why the headline would suggest otherwise.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And maybe just as a quick response to that, like, what would your counterintuitive headline be? Knowing as steeped as you are in the data, like where would you focus if this were, a project you were taking on? And I'm putting you on the spot, so uh,
Well,
I'll acknowledge that.
I already wrote my counterintuitive headline, which was like the basic math problem of non-college pathways because there has been a lot of enthusiasm at schools. And, I think this is true not just in the media, but like in regular people who talk to or educators sort of rethinking like, oh, does everyone need to go to college? Now, I also am not actually sure we ever went to this sort of college for all, as some are now suggesting. And I want to sort of look back at, I think we've sort of forgotten like just how far the pendulum swung in college for all. And I think a lot of people, when they were talking about college for all previously, were really talking about like post-secondary education, including apprenticeships, including learn training to be a welder in some cases in community colleges. But so my counterintuitive headline was like, well, let's look at the actual data about non-college pathways and like remind ourselves that like there are only a limited sets of jobs available for people who don't have college degrees that pay above the national median or national average. I think one thing I'm trying to look into now, and this was some of the pushback I got on the piece, was like, well, okay, it's one thing to say, like, okay, well, great. If you get a college degree and become a lawyer or an engineer or an accountant, like you make a lot of money. But like lots of people start college and don't finish it. Lots of people don't do well in high school and aren't interested in 4 more years of school or even 2 more years of school. So, like, at what margin should we be encouraging someone to go to college? Like, are you really saying that everyone should go to college? And I'm trying to sort of look at more rigorous studies to try to actually answer that question in a more rigorous way. Um, so I'll keep you posted on what my counterintuitive or just like what the truth is headline on that. One benefit of my new role is that I feel less obligated to focus on the counterintuitive, headlines or findings and just say like, well,
The
here's what
data.
I think or here's what the data suggests, regardless of whether they're counterintuitive or intuitive.
Yeah, I will say, it does feel like the intersection of another uh, emergent trend, which is alongside the like college for all push. We had a giant sort of subsidy available that didn't factor the potential career earnings, and
Uh,
that is a controversial in many salons point right now.
you're
But
talking
I
about
think that
student loans or yeah.
yeah, and I think like having loans available that didn't factor earnings
Mm,
creates skews the market so that you don't have to make you can just like go to college, right? And it created this other conversation around the liberal arts versus professional vocational,
mhm.
both degrees and non-degrees, right? And it became this like, I went to a liberal arts school, like the world was your oyster when you went to liberal arts. But like if you were an accounting major at even a, you know,
Mm.
fairly elite school, it was perceived as like you might have more of a ceiling. Right. And so I think it gets into this like, how do you create pathways where there's always upside, or pathways with upside versus pathways that cap downside is to me like a really complicated intellectual question that I think is frankly just harder to answer. And we sort of punted on answering it by just saying, well, we'll just give a subsidy and everybody can go to college. And I think we're sort of paying for that right now.
And I think a lot of it is a question about the macro economy more so than higher education institutions. The other thing I would say in furtherance of that point is that one thing that jumped out to me from looking at the data on the non-college pathways, as I called them, is that a lot of people in the non-college, a significant minority of people in these non-college jobs have college degrees, which is notable. Home health aides, I believe it was almost 20% have college degrees, and even more have some college education and don't have a degree and are working as home health aides. And so that's not to impugn whatsoever people who are taking that job, but I suspect many of the people who are working as home health aides and have college degrees didn't go to college intending to be a home health aide. And that suggests that there are some challenges there, and there are some people who are earning college degrees and who are not getting benefit from that.
Yeah, well, and something I kind of come back to frequently, which is going to college is usually the second most important financial decision you'll make in your life, right? Behind buying a house, maybe behind buying a car if you're savvy about where you go to college, frankly, and don't go to a place that costs an inordinate amount for a poor outcome. But we're asking folks often, again, when we're dealing with that traditional age population, to make a really consequential financial decision without a ton of data on what to expect. And that's sort of my biggest problem with how we approached the subsidization of college. Not that I think it's bad to do, but we said, you wouldn't buy a car or a house without some sort of understanding of historical comps and like what the expected outcome, the depreciation curve on the car or the appreciation on the house. And, that those decisions still carry risk, of course. And going to college carries risk in a potentially even more painful way because you can't discharge college debt bankruptcy. But we don't have any of the ability to project that we do in these other, high consequence financial decisions.
Here's some semi-relatedly, here's actually my better answer to your prior question about my most counterintuitive take is that the students who have the lowest loan balances, college loan balances, often have the hardest time paying off those loans.
Yeah.
And so I just like I feel like this takes like a long time to wrap your head around. It took me a long time, but like that's because the people who have the smallest balances are often going to the lowest value colleges, colleges that don't cost a great deal, and also not staying and finishing a degree. Whereas people who have the highest balances are people who are doctors, who have MBAs, who went to elite universities, and who are having no trouble getting a job. So, I think the stories of the barista who has $100,000 in student loan debt because they have a master's in sociology, those people exist, but they're relatively rare. The more common story, I would say, is the barista or probably the home health aide who has a few credits in elementary education from their local community college or from their local second tier in terms of selectivity state university, but didn't finish. That's the much more common story.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I like no notes other than I think it brings us a little bit full circle to welding and the trades, right? Where those early certifications and some of the trades are better than others at about the progression of certification. And I think you wrote a little bit about this in your article, where you can go and get to a wage earning level fairly quickly. And I sort of, I sort of wish that the mainstream articles about this emphasize that rather than the ability to earn six figures, right? Like that to me is the appeal of like immediate job readiness, semi-immediate job readiness.
I think that's totally right. And then I think the flip side is the sort of the risk of having your body decay in a
Yeah,
blue collar, physically demanding, which is why it is relatively well paid relative to other non college occupations in a physically demanding career. It's one thing to work in construction when you're 25 or 35. What about when you're 55?
yeah.
And I think it's really important to consider the length of someone's careers and the downside risks in some of these physically demanding occupations. And to be honest with people, this is, again, I think you and I are both saying this is not to whatsoever impugn welding or construction or carpenter or any of these jobs as an occupation. I'm thankful that people are doing that sort of work, but to be honest in laying out the pros and cons of all these occupations to young people who are making these really high stakes decisions.
Yeah, and like whether they're union organized or not,
Yeah,
and like
right.
whether there's retirement services,
Yeah.
um, it's sort of like, yeah, I think to your point, like welding in your 20s sounds like a pretty good
Mm.
opportunity if you're also going to school at night to
Yeah.
get a bachelor's degree or to get a further certificate or something. That to me sounds like a good pathway, but I think is less understood by people both in it and people outside of it.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you hopping on. I have appreciated having somebody I can send notes to about these articles that alternately drive me crazy and, make me happy that we're not just, perpetuating the pure college for all myth and saying like, you have options. There are lots of ways to earn a compelling living. And just trying to add good data to those decisions, I think is a shared passion.
Likewise, Matt. I enjoy having this nuance. I enjoy turning our nuanced conversations by email into this chat. Thanks for making it happen, Matt.
Yeah, hopefully we can do it again soon. Thanks,
For
Matt.
sure.
Talk
Like,
soon.
have a good one.